Welcome back to Criminologist. Today, we're diving into one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries of the open ocean. 5 men would set out from the scenic Hawaiian island of Maui on the morning of Sunday, February 11th, 1979, in a 17-foot Boston whaler, the Sarah Joe, for a day of leisurely fishing. Clear skies and peaceful waters awaited them off the coast, and there was every indication that it would be a relaxing Sunday for the sailors. By midday, however, wind picked up and the waters became turbulent. A storm was brewing on the Pacific, and the Sarah Joe was trapped right in the middle of it all. By nightfall, family and friends on the island were fraught with worry for the men on board, and despite rescue attempts being made by authorities, the vessel could not be reached or located. Over the following days, search parties covered some 70,000 square miles of ocean, desperately attempting to locate the 5 men, but ultimately could find no trace of the vessel nor its crew. After weeks of searching, all involved had no choice but to conclude that the Sarah Joe had likely sunk during the storm, claiming the lives of all 5 of its crew. The whereabouts of the wrecked Sarah Joe remained a mystery that investigators were unable to solve until a shocking discovery was made nearly a decade later that left investigators and relatives with more questions than answers. The 5 men who set sail that fateful February day were Scott Moorman, Peter Hanchett, Patrick Woosner, Benjamin Kalama, Ralph Malayakini. They ranged in age between late 20s and late 30s, and there was plenty of seafaring experience among them, with 27-year-old Ralph Malayakini even making his living as a professional fisherman. The men knew each other through construction work and had been friends for years. On the morning of February 11th, Ralph borrowed the Sarah Joe from his brother. The group then headed to the nearby village of Hana, from which the Sarah Joe would depart. None of them had bothered to check weather forecasts, choosing to rely on the clear blue skies and almost still waters as their guide, watching the horizon for any indications of change. This wasn't out of the ordinary for sailors who anticipated being in the open ocean for no more than a few hours. It seemed highly unlikely that any sort of trouble would await them on their short outing, let alone what would come to be the worst regional storm in nearly 50 years. Spirits were high as the men boarded the Sarah Joe, bringing with them light snacks and refreshments, enough to last a day of fishing. The crew set sail into the Alanuihaha Channel shortly after 10 a.m. All seemed well in the channel that day until around 1 p.m., when gale winds began to pelt the coastline and torrential rain began to fall. Family members of the 5 men grew ever more concerned by the massive storm that was headed for the channel. Peter's father, John Hanchett Sr., rushed to the shoreline, attempting to spot the Sarah Joe from land. There was no sign of the small vessel, and the storm was only getting worse. Soon, visibility was too poor for anything of value to be gleaned observing from the island. Large ships began to dock at nearby Hana, managing to escape the clutches of the storm, but the Sarah Joe was not among them. In the early evening hours, radio distress calls from the Sarah Joe reached the island. The sailors reported that they were experiencing engine trouble, effectively trapping them far from shore. Repeated attempts over the following hours to contact the Sarah Joe proved futile. Desperate to locate and rescue those aboard, family members and friends of the men set out in larger boats, searching for any sign of the missing vessel. Low visibility and choppy waters made searching extremely difficult, and by nightfall, the ships were forced to return to the island. The Coast Guard was notified shortly thereafter, and authorities deployed all possible resources the following morning to search for the Sarah Joe. The search was aided by the Coast Guard, Marine Corps, and Civil Air Patrol, alongside privately owned planes, boats, and 3 Navy-trained spotter pigeons used for the first time in an actual search operation. Despite the overhauled efforts, all involved had to come to terms with a grim reality. It would have taken a miracle for the Sarah Joe and its crew to have survived the ferocity of the storm. After 5 days of searching, authorities had no choice but to call off their search, with experts concluding that the Sarah Joe had wrecked during the storm, leaving no survivors. Locals refused to give up hope, however, pooling their resources to fund their own search party. They covered huge swaths of the Alenuihaha Channel and the surrounding areas, even going as far as to search small, nearby islands in the hopes that the men had somehow piloted the Sarah Joe to safety. Days turned into weeks, and soon, even the most optimistic onlookers had no choice but to face the facts. Memorial services were held soon after the tragic conclusion to the search and rescue mission, with Scott, Peter, Patrick, Benjamin, and Ralph being remembered fondly by members of the community. The Sarah Joe incident had a profound effect on the tight-knit community of villagers, and it became an annual tradition to dedicate February 11th in the Sarah Joe's honor, in remembrance of the men, their lives, and their untimely deaths. Without active efforts to locate the Sarah Joe, there was little hope of ever getting closure for family and friends. It was impossible to know what exactly happened after the ship made its last desperate communication with the village. The location of the ship's remains, or those of its crew, remained a mystery. 9 years later, however, a new twist emerged to the case, answering some questions while raising many more. On September 9, 1988, a wildlife expedition led by the National Marine Fisheries Service was conducting research in Ratak Chain of the Marshall Islands, over 2,000 miles away from Maui. While exploring near a coral atoll known as Bokak Atoll, or Tongi Atoll, that was thought to be uninhabited, researchers spotted the remains of a Boston whaler on the island's beach. In an uncanny coincidence, one of the researchers, John Naughton, who spotted the boat, happened to have been part of the initial search party for the Sarah Joe almost a decade earlier. A marine biologist by trade, Naughton had been enlisted by the families of the 5 missing sailors in the early days of the search. Now, the sight of an eerily similar ship to that of the Sarah Joe mystified Naughton, and he embarked with his crew to investigate. Once on land, Naughton inspected the remains of the ship and found that a few letters of the boat registration could be made out, including the first 2 letters, HA, revealing that the boat was registered in the Hawaiian Islands. Naughton was all but sure that this was, in fact, the missing Sarah Joe. Following this discovery, Naughton and his crew scoured the island for further clues or inhabitants. While they found no humans on the island, they quickly made an even more shocking and perplexing discovery: a shallow grave bearing a driftwood cross. While Naughton and his team refrained from excavating the site themselves out of respect, they were able to see bones protruding from the grave, as well as a mysterious stack of blank papers left atop the remains. Naughton's suspicions were confirmed soon after, when the Coast Guard ran the remaining registration numbers of the boat through the system and found that it was a positive match for the Sarah Joe. One piece of the mystery could now be conclusively solved, but the new information immediately raised a tremendous amount of questions. What was the Sarah Joe doing more than 2,000 miles away from where it had started? Who did the grave belong to? Who even built the grave and buried the remains in it? In the weeks that followed, the U.S. Coast Guard sent 6 search teams and a 2-man forensic team from Tripler Army Medical Center in Honolulu to search the area and recover what evidence they could for further analysis. Lab testing revealed that the bones belonged to Scott Moorman, but none of the bones matched other members of the Sarah Joe's crew. Even stranger still, Naughton had not been the first researcher to observe the Bokak Atoll over the past 9 years. In 1984, a U.S. government research survey of the island had been conducted and reported nothing out of the ordinary, meaning that researchers either failed to report the presence of a boat and grave, or the boat and grave were not on the island yet. Both explanations have issues in terms of likelihood and logistics, yet what else could explain this discrepancy? Since the discovery, Experts have estimated that the Sarah Joe would have taken approximately 3 months to drift the distance between Maui and Bokak Atoll, an incredible length of time for anyone to survive, especially given the relative lack of supplies that the men brought with them for the journey. Additionally, the boat likely would have needed to withstand extreme weather conditions, including 40-foot waves that capsized much larger ships during the February 11th storm. Now, 41 years after the initial incident, and almost 32 years after John Naughton's discovery, the Sarah Joe incident remains the subject of much speculation. Different theories have been put forward over the years, including a theory proposed by Hawaii private investigator Steve Goodenow that attempts to explain the mysterious stack of papers found near Scott Moorman's grave. After visiting Bokak Atoll, Goodenow theorized that the papers relate to an ancient Chinese ritual for the burying of the dead, with the papers symbolizing good luck in the afterlife. Chinese fishers have been known to illegally fish in the waters near Bokak Atoll, and it is conceivable that a Chinese fishing vessel came across Scott Moorman's remains in the Sarah Joe, and rather than reporting the findings, chose to bury his remains on a nearby island to avoid punishment for illegal fishing. The presence of the driftwood cross, however, does call this theory into question, as it seems unlikely that a Christian symbol would appear alongside a non-Christian ritual offering. More outlandish speculation claims that the Sarah Joe was caught in a government experiment to alter the weather, thus causing the extreme storm that swept the ship away. There is no evidence to support this. However, debate continues about whether Scott Moorman could have made it to the island alive, with some arguing that he could have survived the 3-month trip by rationing what little supplies he had access to. Others, including Ralph's brother Robert, believe that Scott likely tied himself to the boat to prevent being thrown overboard, and was dead long before reaching Bokak Atoll. The general consensus is that Scott was the sole survivor, with the rest of the men likely being lost to the storm. Nevertheless, prior to John Naughton's discovery, the suggestion that the Sarah Joe would be found 9 years later and more than 2,000 miles away would have seemed extremely far-fetched, leading some to wonder if other members of the crew may have survived, perhaps ending up on other islands across the Pacific. As it stands, there is simply not enough evidence to draw any conclusions about what truly happened to the Sarah Joe. Patrick's brother, Michael Wosner, tries not to focus on the theories and explanations, saying, "It's all speculation. Everyone has their own thoughts on it. The thing is that they didn't come back. They're gone." Even though Scott, Peter, Patrick, Benjamin, and Ralph may be gone, their memory lives on in the hearts and minds of the Hawaiians in Hana and elsewhere, ensuring that their legacy will never die. What do you think happened to the Sarah Joe and its crew? Was it a tragic accident, or could there be something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? Let us know your theories in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update from Criminologist. Join us next time as we dive deeper into the world's most puzzling mysteries.